everybody. Thank you for coming out and spending your Friday night with us. My name is Aimee Chan. I am the new festival director for Right Around the Murray. I am an author and I'm also a bad Chinese. I will explain to you what that means in a few moments. So first off, I'd like to start in the proper way, which is I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, culture, traditions and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that contribute to our community. So tonight this panel is about cultural appropriation. And so we're going to be talking about the concept of cultural appropriation in Australian fiction. While I say I'm an author, I'm really surrounded by the proper authors here, and I'm very excited for you guys to hear what they have to say about this subject. And at the end, there will be opportunity for you guys to ask questions if you would like. So I'll introduce you to our fabulous panel. So on the far end, we have Siang Lu. His first novel is aptly named The Whitewash, given the title of this panel, and it won the ABA Audio Book of the Year. If you have not read or listened to it, it's really kind of an amazing concept and will be very different to anything else that you will have consumed before, so I highly recommend. His second novel, Ghost Cities, which is the one that has currently been released, was a finalist in the Courier Mail People's Choice Queensland Book of the Year Awards. And if you're a social media follower, you might have seen some of his hilarious creations on the hashtag #SillyBookstagram. Next to Siang is Shirley Lee. She is a member of the Sweatshop Writers Collective in Western Sydney. Her writing has appeared in many different titles, including The Age, Overland and Mianjin. And her debut novel is Funny Ethnics, which was today's smash hit at the literary lunch. If anyone was at the Atura with us today, she had the whole room in the palm of her hand. So I'm very excited for you guys to meet her tonight. And our third author is Julie Janson. Her novel, Maduka the River Serpent, was longlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award. She is the winner of the Judith Wright Poetry Prize in 2019, and she'll be speaking about poetry in a panel tomorrow afternoon if that is something that interests you. Her book Benevolence was shortlisted for the Barbara Jeffries Award, the NIB Literary Award and the Boss Literary Award, and its sequel has just been released, and that's the one that's called Compassion, which is what you see on the desk in front of us today. So, I want to explain to you guys, or I'm going to have Siang explain to you guys what a bad Chinese is. So in order to do that, I'm going to invite Siang to read you a little excerpt from his book, Ghost Cities, and give you a little bit of context about what he's going to read, and then he'll explain to us what it means to be a bad Chinese.
It's chucked right in the deep end. So just to set the scene, Ghost Cities is a rather complex book, but it's a book that ultimately follows a young Chinese-Australian man whose name is Siang, no relation to me, who works at the Chinese consulate at Sydney as a translator, but is subsequently fired when it's discovered that he's in fact monolingual and has been using Google Translate for all this job. So I'll be reading the email in which he gets fired. Subject, caught you. HR department. To Lu Xiang. Dear Xiang, at first we thought you were just a fool, dim-wit and slow. Later, we realized that this is much more than that. Finally, we must congratulate you on making it to this point. Half a year, a real achievement. Did you know that a typical entry-level translator role such as yours, the average turnover rate of this sector is 9 months? How close you are to celebrate this milestone. Regrettably, we must fire you with immediate effect. You may look like a Chinese person, but you cannot speak or read Mandarin. You are monolingual, the worst thing in this special context. We regret the graduate program that secured your employment. It will be destroyed. Really, the whole catastrophe is our fault. We made terrible assumptions. Chinese name? Yes. Chinese face? Yes. Arts degree? Must be rich or stupid. We thought the former, but turns out the latter. And the crucial mistake, conducted our interview in English, forgot to test your Chinese. Only we have ourselves to blame. But we caught you in the end. Do you really think we do not see through your silent behavior the early episode of your laryngitis, your terrible pronunciation, unintuitive syntax? Do you really think we do not know you just copy and paste into Google Translate to do all your work? Come on, who do you think we are? We knew from the second day, the third day in the latest. At first we thought it was deference, the way you lowered your head passing us in the hall. Then we realized it was a fear of being exposed as a bad Chinese. We bet that the first thing you do when you receive this email is copy and paste into Google Translate. Remember the episode when the IT department blocked translation website for one afternoon? To see your panic face is priceless. We had secret meetings in your absence. Useless to invite a monolinguist to a bilingual meeting, agree? We estimate that you have a perhaps 50-word Chinese vocabulary. A 2-year-old knows more than your words. Do you not ashamed? We all know that you most dread our Monday roundtable meetings. Always quiet, always politely laughing. Remember the big joke Bo Wenxia told in the meeting last month? It was a test. It was nonsense, a fake joke. You laughed at the absurd joke. The proof was indisputable. 6 months we have let this farce continue because we are afraid that maybe you are somebody's son or nephew. But a comprehensive private investigator report reveals for sure you are not a spoilt child of diplomats, just a fake idiot from the middle class. No such thing as half-yearly health checkup. We sent you to the medical center last week to hold our secret meeting, and we send you again today so we can pack up your desk. Less chance of commotion from disgruntled employee, aka you. Please take your box from reception and go. Someone will replace you on Monday morning. By the way, we snooped your hard drive. Found some poetry you wrote. For laughs, we copy and paste into auto-translate website. It is bad. It is a bad poetry, and you are a bad Chinese person. No use to swipe up. Your card has been deactivated. If you try, security will embrace you.
So I love that email so much, and I wanted you to talk to the audience about, as a Chinese person, I can tell you that that really is a thing. If you can't speak Chinese, people think you are a bad Chinese, you're like not properly Chinese. So what is, can you explain to people, what does it mean to be a bad Chinese, and particularly in the context of being Chinese Australian, what is that trying to bridge the two cultures?
Yeah, and actually before I answer that question, I realized with like a huge jolt of panic while I was reading that piece, is that it's fundamentally a little different from the final copy. So I was reading from the bound proof that goes out a few months before the retail copy, and it's given to bookstores and reviewers, early reviewers, other authors, so that they might sort of sneak in final blurbs and such. And it was one of the last pieces that was edited and changed and had gone through quite a bit of discussion. I had intended it to be funny, of course, and I'm glad you all laughed. But there was a really big sort of conversation that happened internally, which was, and like I had the great pleasure of being edited by Ian C., who's Chinese Australian. Our proofreader was a Chinese Australian as well. And so we had so many diverse perspectives weighing in on, is this funny or is this weighing towards like caricature of a Chinese voice? Are you trying to get laughs from an accent? And that was a real eye-opener for me. And so I was doing all of these edits as I was reading out and like trying to sneak back the edits that I remembered. So if I faltered here or there, that's the reason. But it was, in the end, a real privilege to have been read. I guess the word is like a sensitivity reader. by so many, like a real committee, and I felt that it was a real sort of privilege. But to answer your original question about what it means to be a bad Chinese, I'm so glad that you mentioned that phrase and applied it to yourself, because it was really an act of opening myself up to cultural shame by putting that down and coining the phrase, right? And yeah, I mean, I think any member of the diaspora who's sort of grown up in Australia and has not had sort of a rigorous, forced parental, you must learn the language and be as fluent as we are, which sort of messes kids up in all sorts of other different ways. There's a really common thing that happens, and you know, I've had Vietnamese people, Indian people come up to me and say, I am bad Chinese. And what they mean is, you know, typically we have really large families, and we have these family gatherings where you really just dread them because there are any number of aunts and uncles who come up to you, and they know because they asked you last year, you know, and it's like, and they'll say in the dialect, or, you know, can you speak Chinese yet, or insert language here? And you know, the way that most of us navigate that is with a bit of self-deprecation and humor, which is we figure out a way to say the one phrase properly to get them off our backs. But that, again, sort of leads into that whole cultural shaming. So it's not only from our own families, but it's very internalized as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can 100% relate to that. I have a very good friend who is also Asian Australian, and we jokingly always refer to me as the fake Asian because I don't take my shoes off in the house, I don't drink boba tea, I don't like Asian dessert, and it is part of that. That's like self-depreciating before somebody else can insult you. So I totally understand where you're coming from. So Shirley, before I get you to read your passage, I guess what I'm sort of wanting to think about as we talk about your book is there such thing as a good Chinese, especially in the context of representations of Asian Australian women? So I'd like to invite you to give us a little bit of context about your passage and then read a little bit from Funny Ethnics.
The passage that I'm about to read is of the protagonist, Sylvia Nguyen, as she's just starting Year 7 at a elite academically selective school that's far from her hometown in Western Sydney, and this is a moment that she's having after school. That evening, my parents were in Fairfield for a funeral, so it was just me and the TV. I took a square of instant noodles and poured boiling water on it. The noodles puffed up, and sparkling circles of chili oil swirled alongside green flakes of spring onion. I carried the bowl of noodles into the living room and put it on the glass coffee table. I sat cross-legged on the carpet, channel surfing. CSI, Desperate Housewives, 2.5 Men, guns, blood, and boobs with American accents. My finger pressed number 2 on the remote for ABC. A white man in a black wig wore rectangle glasses and a lab coat. He spoke in a short, choppy accent. You are in the Wong lab, and I always say physics is fun, but I spell fun with a PH. I grabbed the TV guide in the Sydney Morning Herald on the table. The show was called We Can Be Heroes. It was a mockumentary series by Australian comedian Chris Lilly, and it portrayed 5 fictitious nominees for the real-life title of Australian of the Year. I turned the volume up higher. Ricky Wong, the Asian character Chris Lilly was playing, giggled at his own crappy jokes and was an academic overachiever with overbearing parents. I squinted through the fog of steam billowing from my bowl and scooped up a chopstick load of noodles. Chris Lilly, showing everyone how things really were. Those weirdly smart Asians were just silly creatures, utterly incapable of any real creativity or individuality, forever losers who were only useful to Australian society as human calculators. Except I wasn't even smart. In the first week of school, I stood at my locker and I overheard a Year 10 girl gossiping with her friend nearby. "Oh, don't worry about Mai. She does tons of tutoring, so it's not like she's naturally smart." I thought about all the tutoring I did to get into this school. Was I just a cheater, undeserving of opportunity, like all those newspaper articles implied? It dawned on me that I was a bird-brained Asian, too chicken to ask teachers to explain things again, and too obsessed with making meaning out of chicken wire. I lifted the bowl up to my face and tipped oily yellow broth into my mouth. The salty flavours glided over my tongue, flooding out every thought in my brain. So, in the extract that I just read out, Sylvia Nguyen is internalising the feelings of being misrepresented as an Asian Australian and as a Vietnamese Australian girl on mainstream Australian TV. And when I wrote this extract, I really wanted to tap into those feelings that I once felt growing up in Australia and not seeing myself really being represented. Or if I did see Asian Australians being represented, it was through the lens of someone else. And so the hurtful kind of language in some of the texts, such as she thinks that Asians are just silly creatures who can't be really creative or have any individuality, that comes from a period of time in the early 2000s when there were a lot of newspaper articles in New South Wales speaking about how there were too many Asians crowding out the top elite schools in Sydney. And the effect of that was the Department of Education modified the test, the entrance test to get into these schools, by adding a creative writing component, as if to say that that would fix this problem of having too many Asian students getting into those schools, as if to say that being Asian means you're just good at rote learning and you are not capable of authoring a creative story. And so to answer your question, is there such thing as a good Asian person? I think for me personally, as someone who has taken hold of the pen to author her own story, I'm not too concerned whether I am a good Asian or not. What I'm concerned with is being fully human. And to be fully human is to have a complex and nuanced story to tell. Whether the stereotypes, especially for the Vietnamese Australian community, the stereotypes about us have ranged from the early 90s to being involved in drug and crime gangs in Cabramatta. Those were the types of stories that we saw about us in the media, to the early 2000s, where suddenly we were part of this overachieving Asian Australian crowd that was flooding all these elite schools. So we can see that there are two ends of a spectrum of stereotypes. There's the bad stereotype, but apparently also the good stereotype. Either spectrum is dehumanising. Being good, being expected to fit into a bad Asian trope or a good Asian trope is dehumanising. So I'm just concerned with being Asian and being human and telling a story from that point of view.
Yep. So I guess part of what we are getting at is that cultural stereotypes are designed to pigeonhole us and to force us into a particular box that we don't want to fit into, because we're all individual humans with lots of different complexity. So just before we get to Julie, I wanted to have a quick word with you, Shirley, about when I first came across a writers collective called Sweatshop. I didn't know anything about it. I was Googling the word sweatshop came up, and immediately my hackles went up, and I thought, what is this? Do these people not know the context of this word? It is so racist. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I clicked, and I saw all these Asian faces, and then I thought, oh, well, maybe they're allowed to use that word. I don't know. And so it was an interesting thought process I had to go through about, first of all, finding out what sweatshop was, and then thinking about processing who can reclaim what words and in what context in which we reclaim them. So can you speak a little bit to that, about sweatshop, what it does, and also the choice of terminology, which I take it would be a very deliberate choice?
So Sweatshop is a literacy movement based in Western Sydney, founded by Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed. And Muhammad chose the word sweatshop to put forward an image of weaving words together and working hard to weave words together. Yes, as a Vietnamese Australian person whose own mother worked in a sweatshop to make enough money to feed a family, I was curious about that word, but sitting down with Muhammad and kind of understanding that, I think a lot of the work that we do at Sweatshop is to empower First Nations writers and writers from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, such as myself, through critical thinking. And we're deeply influenced by the work of African American scholar Bell Hooks. And there's a concept that Bell Hooks writes a lot about, and it's called coming to voice. And so we empower the writers in our collective to move from silence to speech as a revolutionary gesture. And the journey from moving from silence to speech is one of critical thinking. And so when we sit down in our workshops and we speak about how our communities are being represented, we're engaging in the act of critically thinking about the narratives that we're being boxed into. And the conversations that we have are liberating and empowering in breaking free from those boxes. And so that is the work that Sweatshop does, and this is a product of that work and of being part of those conversations and that collective for the past 10 years.
So I think part of, being in a room full of people who love books and love stories is that we understand that part of developing critical thinking is to have diversity of representation in all forms of media, not necessarily just books. So one of the things I often feel is with our First Nations history is it has been so erased that I would love to see it more incorporated into our books and our stories. But as somebody who is not First Nations, and in fact I was living out of the country for a good decade during the time when we started to slowly re-accept our First Nations trauma and history back into today's context, I don't know. Am I allowed to write about Indigenous characters? Is this something that I can include in my books? Because it's not my experience. So, Julie, I would love you to do a little bit of a reading from your book and talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. She's a wonderful person. She sent us about 10 emails each. We all feel very loved to be here with Aimee. Okay, thank you. I'll give a tiny bit of context about this book. It's the second of a trilogy, although if I live long enough there will be a third. And the first one was Benevolence, and it's a story based on the story of my 3 times great-grandmother on the Hawkesbury River, a Burra woman of Darug Nation who was a traditional woman, and her family story and the descendants of women. I follow the women because they were the women who carried the Aboriginal blood in our family, up to my father, Neville. And this book is the second of that story. I had a child who was abandoned in the first, whose name was Eleanor, which is our family middle name. And I often wondered after I'd written Benevolence what happened to Eleanor, and so I decided I'd write a novel to find out. And this is Eleanor's story. And this is partially based on my family story, but it's not called historical fiction for nothing. There's very little information about the early lives of Aboriginal women along the Hawkesbury River, and very few birth certificates or marriage certificates. or anything to give us any real evidence. So often you have to base it on a lot of deep research about the history of the Hawkesbury or the history of anywhere in Australia to find the Aboriginal history. And it's quite an arduous task to find those little gleanings and little seeds of history and to weave them together into a narrative that is believable. Anyway, I've been asked to read from the book, so this is the pages that have been chosen by Aimee. There must be a reason for this one. So we'll go straight to... After a long drought, Mr. Bryant shot his dying cattle. Another awful day. I sat on the step of the farmhouse, and in the distance I saw an approaching horse. It was the postman. He seldom stopped at Bryant's farm, but this time he trotted up to me and winked. A letter addressed to Bryant, but it's got darn feathers on it like it was dropped in an emu nest. Give it here, I said, and stretched out my hand. The postman dangled the brown paper parcel in front of me. For the master only, not a girl. He knocked on the door and Bryant came out and snatched the article while counting out mean coins for the postman. I was incensed and saw myself snatch the letter and fart in Bryant's face. Is that letter from Mary James? I asked. No harm for you to see it. I can barely read myself. He coughed and spat. You, however, are a clever girl, but it ain't addressed to you. I might just stick it up my rectum. The sun poured down and flies clung to our faces. I felt as if I would crack in half. Bryant grinned and slammed the door. I peeped through the window and saw him place the letter in a drawer with other letters. I was certain it was from my mother and she wanted to find me. I waited until late at night and I climbed through the back window into the kitchen and made my way to his sitting room where he had his desk. On the desk was a human fetus in liquid. It was a native child sucking its thumb with grey lips. I thought it was his half-caste child. I heard rumours of such doings. Had he aborted it with a sharp tool? Horror tore through my heart and I wished Mr. Bryant dead again. Not just quite dead, but poisoned with rat bait lying in a cesspit. Quietly, I opened the drawer. The letter shone, and it was indeed decorated with string and emu feathers. I sniffed the parchment and hugged it to my chest. Suddenly, a creaking floorboard and a candle light flickered above my bent head. My breathing stopped. I held my breath in terror, heart beating like thunder. Now he would throttle me. Having a peep, are we? Murmured Bryant as he appeared in his sleeping shirt with a tight nightcap on his head. No harm done, you are just wanting a lookie. Nice letter it is, clean paper and real interesting. His skull looked like the end of a pork sausage. He held a candle high and gritted his yellow teeth. He took the letter gently from my hand and placed it on the desk. I was about to read it. He smiled and I leant towards it, the beckoning paper. A fist slammed into my face. I saw sparks and watched the poor baby head in the greenish glass, its eyes pressed close as I sank to the floor. Whose was it? I wondered as I checked my teeth. My teeth loosened and I spat blood. The drops ran onto the boards and I made a puddle. Stealing, is it, you little trollop? He yelled and snatched the paper away and tucked it under his arm. Give me the letter. It's from her. I want to read it. I tell you what, I'll let you have it if you promise to be kind to me. We can have some fun now you're nearly growing up.
Yeah, you're right, Julie. I quite deliberately chose that passage because it's confronting, but it is also the literal taking away of voice and story and narrative from Indigenous women by the colonialist man.
Yeah.
So why is it so important then in the reclaiming of this history, even if it's historical fiction, for this to be done by someone from the ethnicity that we're trying to reclaim?
Well, look, I was very lucky. I grew up in a very poor family along the Lane Cove River, and my mother was English, my father was Aboriginal, but my mother was really keen on me getting an education because she never had any herself, and neither did Dad. They only had about 5 years each. And when I went to university, which was the first person in my family to do so with my brother, much to the shock of other Aboriginal people in the family who kind of went, why would you want to do that? And the only books that we were given at the University of New South Wales when studying English were all by English writers and all by men. And I had this kind of craving, while I love literature, you know, I fell in love with Keats, for example, you know, but this desperate need to kind of hear my own voice and the voices of my family and Australian voices. You know, we didn't even read, you know, Miles Franklin or, you know, or Eleanor Dark or any Australian women or men for that matter at university. So many years later when I became an adult and I became a writer, it was very important to me to put Indigenous women in centre stage. I began as a playwright and every single protagonist in my plays was a woman and usually an Aboriginal woman. And it became important to me to fill that gap. Even we had the great writers like Davis over in West Australia, and we also had Bobby Merritt, but men were always the main people, so it just became important to unleash those voices.
Mm-hmm. So, Shirley, does that mean then, as writers of fiction, then we should really only be writing about our own lived experience? Because at what point does imagination and creativity become important in creating diversity within our characters, but at the same time being sensitive to the fact that maybe some of the experiences we're reflecting are not our experiences?
Sorry, is that for me? I think that's a very interesting question in that I actually think that everyone is writing from their lived experience. So my position is that all writing is inherently autobiographical. And I'm going to nominate an example of Star Wars. Star Wars is created by George Lucas, and I think when it comes to the genre of science fiction, many consumers of that genre think that it's pure imagination, that these are made-up worlds pulled out of thin air. But if we read some interviews that George Lucas has done, he has specifically said that a big inspiration behind Star Wars is the Vietnam War and his personal feelings about America's role in that war. And so what we start to understand is that Star Wars is George Lucas's personal response to a significant historical event. And for anyone who's seen Star Wars, you might know the character of the Ewok, which is this cute, chubby little teddy bear-like creature that's grunting and snuffling and waddling through these jungles. George Lucas has also said in interviews that the Ewoks are inspired by the Vietnamese guerrilla fighters for the Viet Cong, the communist side of the war, of the Vietnam War. And so I think that's an example of George Lucas's work being quite autobiographical. What we're understanding from Star Wars are his feelings about America being an imperial power that's meddling in this civil war, but also of his personal feelings about Vietnamese people in that war, that some of these guerrilla fighters, who are some of the fiercest fighters in world war history, he's portrayed them as these teddy bear-like creatures. And so for creators like myself, who are coming in from the margins and taking hold of the pen, I don't really want to see myself as an Ewok. I want to see myself as a human being. And so it's important for me to reclaim my space in being able to tell my own story.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a critical part, I think, of the kind of rewriting of history, and as we start to support and see more minority voices from all different types of backgrounds, not necessarily just ethnic, that's an important part of people claiming back their own story. But then when you are writing a complex novel, Siang, where there are multiple different characters of all different types of experience, how do you then make the choice that, is it appropriate for me to try to reclaim a story that has clearly been historically written in a way that might not be sensitive or relevant or correct? Are you allowed to claim that story if that is not your lived experience? Or, as a creator, is that part of what your job is to imagine and create and, imagine new worlds that might not be your experience?
That's such an interesting question. I've never been asked that, and I've got, I think, the correct response, luckily. My first book was called The Whitewash, and it is an oral history of the sort of the first attempt to create a China-Hollywood co-production blockbuster in the vein of a James Bond or a Mission Impossible, starring for the first time an Asian lead in the role. And our protagonist of that book, it's a comic novel. As I mentioned, it's told in the form of an oral history, so it's many voices. And that character, J.K. Jr., is described as not the smartest tool in the shed, but definitely the hottest. And he gets whitewashed out of the role. And it's a satire. It's a book that's filled with ridiculous characters, but it's also quite serious as well, and deeply, deeply researched. So there's something that's wrong with my brain where if I create a character who is an expert in, say, Asian representation, then I have to know as much as that character. So I essentially educated myself by way of reading a lot of academic texts, historical books, but also primarily watching over 400 films in that looked at Asian representation from Hollywood. And I think it's interesting to remember that cinema is a pretty new form of media still. It's only 100 years old. And so the representation of Asian characters specifically has just been absolutely heinous from day one. The interesting thing, especially as a member of the diaspora growing up and sort of consuming so much of your culture through the television, is that it's really difficult to identify a lack of something. What we are missing is the people that look like us on the screen, people who are written by Asian or diverse voices, by which I mean authentically. And this is all a very, very long-winded way of saying that through all of that, the troves of research that I did, and honestly, I'm so burnt out from watching films, I haven't willingly watched one since 2022, but I don't regret it, is that a fairly large portion of that research was based on Bollywood. And I did, in fact, have an early draft of The Whitewash that included Indian characters. Now, the retail version of that book doesn't have an Indian voice in it, and there isn't a treatise on whitewashing in Bollywood. And that wasn't a discussion that I had with my editors or my publisher. I made the decision that this was not my story to tell.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. For anybody who doesn't know, I'm actually going to make Siang watch another Kung Fu movie, because on Sunday he will be out at the Regent Cinema watching Enter the Dragon. We've got a 50-year retrospective screening of the movie, and he's going to talk a little bit more about this. But one of the things that I just wanted, since you brought it up, I want to focus a little bit on that concept of Bruce Lee. I find really interesting, because on the one hand, it is such a cultural stereotype, what he represents, what he says about Asian cinema and Asian masculinity. But on the other hand, this is actually what made him so famous and has made him so iconic and has allowed Kung Fu and now Gun Fu and all these other iterations to thrive in Hollywood, is that he lent into the cultural stereotype. So can you talk to me a little bit about, do you feel that there's sort of a burden in a way? On the one hand, we don't want to claim stories that are not ours, so we try to be sensitive to our lived experience, but at the same time, I'm going to steal a phrase I heard Shirley use today, which is the burden of representation. The burden of coming to, say, a festival like this and thinking, maybe I'm here because I am the token First Nations author, the token diaspora author.
Yeah, it's a complex one. I have been invited to festivals where the only panel, Shirley and I were talking about this last night at dinner, the only panel that I've been invited to is the diversity panel. And it's a troubling sort of situation. And we were sort of talking about different authors' perspectives on that. And where I settled on it was, that's fine with me. I'm more than happy to accept that burden of representation, but also, perhaps, if it's possible, panel us for something else, because we're not just the token Asian writer or the token Indigenous writer. And it's a very individual response, and I think that we have to respect each individual's opinion on where they stand on it, because it is such a heavy burden. I do take it as a privilege as well. Pretty recently, I was at Bellingen Writers Festival on the stage with Leah Purcell and Yumna Kassab, and we all three, without having discussed it, sort of looked at each other and agreed right then and there on the stage that the burden of representation is very heavy, but we accept that willingly because we want to advocate for our own lived experience and show others that it can be possible.
Great. So, Julie, with the particular and quite deliberate erasure of First Nations history and stories, do you feel that burden of representation even more?
No, I think actually I celebrate the emergence of all the First Nations writers around. Without writers like Oodgeroo Noonuccal when I was young, Kath Walker, her early poems, the plays of Jack Davis and Eva Johnson, and going to Black Theatre. You know, I'm old enough to remember Black Theatre. I was in my early 20s, and it was in Redfern. And that exhilaration of seeing Aboriginal actors like Justine Saunders and ending up working and being quite a close friend of Justine Saunders, Lillian Crombie, Kevin Smith, those wonderful actors. And the excitement of seeing the growth, especially now, of all these wonderful young and not so young Indigenous writers coming through. And I'm honoured and thrilled to be part of that, because I didn't grow up on a mission. I didn't grow up in a strong Aboriginal family. I grew up with a father who never talked about being Aboriginal. His sisters would say he had jaundice as a baby, that's why he's so dark. And Dad was really dark. So in a way it's reclaiming that cultural identity through my writing, but feeling that I'm just part of standing on the shoulders of all these great writers that have gone before me. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. And I feel honoured to be accepted amongst the ranks, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. So, Siang, you talked earlier about your bound proof and having sensitivity readers. Can you explain to the audience what a sensitivity reader is?
I still don't know. And guys, feel free to pitch in if I've gotten anything wrong. I wasn't expecting to have sensitivity readers on my book. It sort of just happened that way. It happened that my editor was Chinese Australian, and he was Ian was project managing that, so he had the final edit. But I worked primarily with a brilliant editor called Kama Pham, and she's Vietnamese, I believe, and she and I were, really lucky to have been paired up together for the first book and then the second, and that really gave both of us this just warm feeling of this is some wonderful partnership that we're embarking on. I believe Kama is my first sensitivity reader. This is probably not the answer that you were expecting, but in the whitewash, I mentioned JK Jr., the hot lovable hunk. His on and off again girlfriend, Angela Moo, for narrative reasons which I won't go into here, essentially becomes a social media star by falling asleep on stream, and she becomes known as Snoring Beauty and sort of gets all of the fame, adulation and recognition and wealth that was eluding her in her sort of longed for acting career, which never really took off. We had tremendously exciting and interesting conversations between Camera and myself, because if you sort of leaf through the print copy of The Whitewash, you'll see pretty immediately that it's not really structured like a regular book. It's sort of more in the form of a series of transcripts. So if you've ever read an oral history, Vanity Fair do these a lot, the oral histories of Mad Men and Breaking Bad and so on, you'll sort of know what I mean by having that orchestra or that cavalcade of voices that sort of here's this person's name, producer, and then, a paragraph that they were interviewed by whoever was holding the mic. And sort of cutting all of these together and assembling a collage. Basically, I'd had it so that most characters in the book get given their name and their title, and it doesn't really change. The title that I'd given to Angela was On Again, Off Again Girlfriend of J.K. Jr. And you're nodding, Julie, I think you can see where this is going, is that Kama said to me, this is actually perhaps something that we could improve, because you're essentially framing one of your main characters from, like, in relation to a man. Mm-hmm. And I had never thought of that before. It had simply never occurred to me. And it was this blind spot that I was so welcoming of being pointed out that I see as the quintessential sensitivity reader experience.
Yeah,
I should end that story by saying that we then gave Angela a lot of agency through the various titles, where you can actually see she's the one character that over the course of the book her titles change significantly, and so she's trying on these various hats. And in fact, we subverted it too. Spoiling it, but there's an on again, off again element, and the spoiler alert is that they end up back together at the end of the book. And J.K. Jr.'s title at the very last part of the book is On Again Boyfriend of Angela.
She's actually my favourite character by the end of that novel. I really liked her. So, Shirley, then when it comes to this kind of construction of different characters and different experiences, it's interesting to me what Siang said about that we can perhaps, as an example, on this panel we're talking about cultural sensitivity, but then maybe you've brought in, everybody is bringing in other biases that you might not realise, maybe able-bodiedness or gender or whatever it might be. So do you think that this is, how do you as an author then self-edit yourself to try to make sure that your own biases are not creeping in the way that George Lucas's were, for example?
I think my understanding of sensitivity readers was that they're specifically brought in to read a section or maybe the whole work from their kind of like into their specific identity and then reading whether it's offensive or not. Whereas Kamha Pham was also an editor on my book, so it was lovely to have a Vietnamese person edit the book, but I wouldn't really see her role as a sensitivity reader. For me, it's the editing process. For me, as a writer, I don't try and edit myself. I write what I know, and the editing process is entirely something else that I very much respect as part of putting together a work like a book. And so the relationship between an editor and a writer I take very seriously, and it's the conversations that I have with editors such as Kamha in the margins that greatly informs the work as well. And so I view that as very much a collaborative process. In terms of my own blind spots and biases, I'm always open to having conversations about that. I'm not too concerned with censoring myself in my work. I think I want to just stand in the truth of the experience. And from then on, if there's lessons to be learned from that, I'm happy to have those conversations with readers after the fact. And at Sweatshop, because I am surrounded by so many writers from different cultures and experiences, I think organically, though, a lot of those conversations and a lot of those collaborations have informed my perspective of the world as well. But I think everyone inherently has blind spots, and the issue with our culture today as a critical thinking culture, I think we should be more open to having conversations where we're held accountable, but in a way where we leave space for people to still redeem themselves, rather than having conversations where we completely cut people off.
Yep.
Very good.
So, Julie, when we talk about sensitivity readers and being culturally sensitive, one thing I've definitely noticed in our industry, in the arts, is there's a big focus on if there are any First Nations elements in a piece of art or a book or something, that you must demonstrate that you have consulted with community and that there has been appropriate research done before you present this if you are not part of that community. And it seems to be something that's very, very specific to Indigenous culture.
Yeah.
And one thing I often think about is, as an Asian Australian writer living in Albury, how do I get this access? Who do I approach? I don't want to presume that every First Nations person wants to be my sensitivity reader. So from your perspective, what is the best way to go about trying to do this research and make sure that we are consulting community, but not in another way passing on the burden of the responsibility to make sure things are appropriate onto somebody else?
I don't think there's any answer for that. Tony Birch once said the horse is bolted. In other words, people are going to write what they're going to write, and you just got to wear it. So in a way, somehow all those cultural protocols, about 10 pages of them on the Creative Australia website. Why didn't they just keep it Australia Council? And look, I think people pay lip service to it and attempt to find the sensitivity. I had one experience, and I won't name names because I never think that's useful, but I had a person contact me through my website, and I always try to be really generous to beginner writers because I didn't really feel that happened for me, and I struggled to get published for a very long time. So I'm quite generous with my time. And a person wrote to me, and they were writing a novel of a certain cultural position in the early days of Australia, and they wanted some advice about the Aboriginal characters they were using, and the information about those Aboriginal characters in the very early days of Sydney's history is available in any kind of good history book. Even verbatim conversations with Bidji or Bennelong, with Governor Phillip or whatever. And they were using those conversations to create a story around a person of a different ethnic background in the early days of Australia. And she wrote quite a long passage and sent it to me, said, "Can I send it to you?" And I kind of got this stage. I'd written to her about 5 times with advice. I said, "Okay, fine." And I read it, and I was quite shocked at the kind of pidgin English, which was much more than needed to be there. And I use an abbreviated English, an Aboriginal English, especially if I'm working with stories about the Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory that I lived amongst for quite a long time. But in her case, it was kind of a borrowed notion that this is how she would portray people. And I wrote back and I said, "Look, it's great that you've made an attempt at this, but I think that it's appropriate that you," and publishers will agree on this, is that because you're a person of a non-Indigenous background, this is not going to sit well in this novel. Why don't you concentrate on the particular perspective of the person you're writing from, and write what you know, and don't attempt to create these characters which appear to be a kind of a pastiche, almost grotesque. And she wrote back and told me that I didn't know what I was talking about, and her Irish people were going to be portrayed in a certain way, and at which stage I just wrote back and said, "Well, if you can't take the advice, I'm sorry," and I just blocked her on both the phone which I normally don't do. I'm a person, I do like to interrelate with other writers and speak to them, because I think that's how we learn from each other. But there was a stubbornness there which I just thought, oh, for God's sake, you're not even paying me, give us a break. But I was thinking when I was listening to these other two writers here too, is that I heard this thing said about, especially for novelists, that every novelist has a slither of ice in their heart. And I thought about that, and I thought, really? Really? And I thought, oh yes, that is so perceptive. So if you're very good friends of a novelist, or someone in your family is a novelist, be very careful what you say. I literally, someone says something, I say, oh great, can I have that? And I write it down on my phone. In a way, it's almost a cruelty. And I'm a grandmother. I've got 6 grandchildren. I've got 3 children. I think of myself as a kind and generous auntie. But there's that little bit of coolness and cruelty in you when you write a novel. And you're like a bowerbird picking up every little bit. And it's not plagiarism, because you're just borrowing from everything all the time. And it's in a way, it's a kind of a coolness that you have to have in order to do the work that we do. I don't know.
So I guess the answer in a way to what we've all been talking about is, when we're asking whose story is it, in some ways it's everybody's story and it's nobody's story, because we're telling our own stories.
Yeah.
But to tell the story, we have
agree
to
with
pick
what Shirley said. Yeah.
bits from everyone else as well.
Yeah.
So we do have a few minutes. I wanted to give an opportunity for the audience to ask any questions that you might have of our fantastic panel. There is a roving mic, so if you have a question, stick your hand up and we'd love to hear it. Very quiet crowd.
We'll just sing a few songs.
No questions?
Hello everyone, I'm Eleanor, and this is such an interesting panel for me because I've just written a children's story called The Girl with a Feather in Her Hair, and it's about a bushwalk that I do, and really the whole idea behind it is connection to country, and obviously that's such a big Indigenous theme, and I was very aware of how I could honour and recognise and promote Indigenous perspective through this story, and I actually consulted with an Indigenous friend, and she pretty much said, you've got to just take a risk with these things because someone won't like it and someone will like it. But in the end I decided I'm not Indigenous, this is my story, and so even though I acknowledge the connection to land within the story, it doesn't have any kind of Indigenous representation. But then what I really wanted to do was dedicate the book to the traditional custodians of the land on which I walk. And I just don't want it to be a tokenistic thing. It truly is what I want to do because I love the land so much and I do want to honour it, and I feel like part of that is honouring the traditional custodians. But again, I don't want it to be tokenistic, and is it my blind spot? And yeah, that's...
I would say go with your heart. I mean, many times acknowledging country is really, really important to Aboriginal people. I mean, I've got some elder friends where I live on Yuin country now in Maruya, and there's one elder, Uncle Bunja, most wonderful man, who we broke our hearts during that referendum, lead up to the referendum. We worked so hard to get a yes vote and we failed. And Uncle Bunja's heart was broken. He spoke to 40 different groups on the south coast, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, trying to get us across the line. So it was a very, very hard period in his life. And Uncle Bunja, whenever we meet together with him, either in a formal meeting or even an informal party, always ask Uncle Bunja to do a welcome to country because we're on his country, it's Brinja Yuin country. And his face just lights up with this huge smile because it's this great pride he's got in that this is my country and I welcome you, brothers and sisters, here with us to enjoy this. This is this generosity of spirit rather than feeling it's an obligation. So acknowledging that you're on the country in a book, I think, is a fantastic thing to do if you're walking there in the bush and you're admiring the bush from your own particular perspective. But to acknowledge that it's the particular, it's Wiradjuri country or it's Bundjalung country or it's Yuin country, I think it's just plain courtesy. Really. Yeah. And it's so much appreciated. You can't believe how much people appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
Any more questions? Good.
We were just talking to ourselves about your comment about a sensitivity editor. Is that a new concept of
No, I
publishing? Or is that-
understand. Sorry, I understand that it's sensitivity reader.
Oh, reader, okay.
Yeah.
So is that something that's been around for a while?
No, I think I might have introduced this confusion, which is that I myself, am not super familiar with sensitivity readers. We sort of happened into a committee of such. They just happened to be my editors. So I don't believe there are sensitivity editors as a role, but there are definitely editors and sensitivity readers, and I believe they have their own specific parts to play in the process.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to make a comment about sensitivity readers, though. I've never used the services of a sensitivity reader, and I've never been a sensitivity reader. But I'd encourage everyone to think, if Siang, Julie, and myself here today put our time towards being sensitivity readers in other people's projects rather than writing our own books, we wouldn't be here on this panel today offering or providing the knowledge that we have of our own stories. So I think that's an aspect of that particular part of the industry that shouldn't be ignored.
I'd like to say something a little bit about editors too. If there's any editors in the room, we worship you. You are like gold.
Yes.
A short anecdote about my most recent book, this one, Compassion. I was working with an editor called Jane Messer, who I was working with through the Australian Society of Authors. You can find an editor through the Australian Society of Authors. And if you're lucky, you can get some funding for it. If not, you just got to pay for them, which is awful that people want to be paid for their work, isn't it? I can't. And anyway, I'd been working with Jane for a while, and she got my novel, and she said, Julie, this novel is full of the most amazing treasures, and it's like opening a box, and it's full of all these stories and anecdotes and characters. And she said, it's a great big overstuffed couch. And I went, oh, feeling, a bit kind of uncomfortable about this comment. And she said, and what it needs, a good couch needs, is 3 buttons to pull the couch together. And the first button is your character's father, her mother, and her child, who appear in the novel. But if you can bring those characters up into the novel, the couch will hold together as one thing. And it was such a simple metaphor, and it was like magic. So I rewrote the book and brought those characters forward, and suddenly, snap, the whole book worked. And without her, I really, I'd still have the big overstuffed couch, which mostly would be sitting on my computer and no one would be publishing it. So I just think, a good editor, and they're really worth paying for, even if you're a poor, struggling beginner writer.
I think we had a couple of questions.
Hi there, my name's Nick, and I'm in the throes of writing my first comedic show, and I'm finding that the impetus to write that show was really strong in the beginning, and now that I'm struggling to see the forest from the trees, and I'm close to putting the show on, I kind of go, is this actually worth telling? This story that I've put together, because I've been reviewing it for so long and editing for so long. So I'd love to hear more about your processes, about how you separate yourself from the work to also make it feel like it's a story worth telling for you, because it's something that you've worked on for such a long period of time. If there's an internal process that you go through, particularly after you release a work, and then you're working on maybe a second or third piece. What's that internal process, if you have one, that makes a story worth telling for you?
So I'm really good friends with Mirandi Riwo, who wrote Stone Sky Gold Mountain. She won't mind me sullying her name, hopefully. And also Laura Elvery, who's written, wonderful short story collections. And the Brisbane writing community is very close. Laura and Mirandi are writing partners, or they're part of the same writing group. And they encourage each other, they read each other's works, and Mirandi, at some point had hit the wall and said, I'm not really sure what to do. And Laura, remembering that Laura is her best friend, said, well, anytime you're stuck, I give you the same advice, which is just write about food. And the thing that I realized after that comment was, having read and loved Mirandi's books, there's incredible descriptions of just the most fragrant foods, delicious foods that make me so hungry every time I read them. And she said that she took that advice and she started writing about food, and then she got back on the horse and she found the passion for the writing again. And I've often joked to Mirandi that my version of that is jokes. And so Mirandi has probably a description of food every maybe 1 or 2 pages. And, it kind of goes back to that old adage of at least have one gem on the page. And for her, that's that thing. And for me, it's the jokes. So I think it's more about focusing and locking in on the thing that drew you to the project in the first place. And if it's a comedic project, then you've got to be laughing while you're writing it. I think that's probably the thing, is to come back to the first principles of enjoying the thing for the reason why you came to it in the first place.
I would also echo what Julie said earlier about a really good editor is invaluable. So I know with a couple of my manuscripts, some of the ones that have sold better, when I look at the original manuscript versus what we ended up going to print, the big difference has been not the idea or the voice, it's been the editor who's come along and said, you have the overstuffed couch, you need to do A, B and C, and just those tiny tweaks are enough to make it work. And for me, a really good editor, it could be a good friend if it was somebody who worked in publishing, but most of my friends don't. So I find a good editor for me has to be someone in the industry. Giving manuscripts out to my friends doesn't really give me the kind of critical feedback I need, because they would just, it's really great, good on you, keep going. You need the editor to say, do you know what, the idea is good, but actually this sucks, and you need to go rewrite it. And that is kind of what will then help you find the focus to find the passion again.
Yeah, just to jump on that too. So the reason The Whitewash exists as a book is that it was lucky enough to win the Unpublished Manuscript Award at the Queensland Literary Awards. And I've since become friends, circa 2021, with each of the fellow shortlisters in that category. And it's a very wonderful friendship, because it could easily have become a fraught thing. One of us has been published, the others haven't. One of us is the winner, the others have just nearly made it to the line. And I sort of see it as my responsibility to help them get published. And that's a very sort of its own long story. But what I want to say, sort of in relation to you and your comments, Aimee, is that the common thread we found amongst the 4 shortlisters was that each of us had had our manuscripts professionally edited. And it was just a really crucial experience of getting that much closer to the final product.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are running out of time, unfortunately, and while I would love to run over time and give you more time for more questions, we have an amazing event after this called Sovereignty. So I encourage everybody to stick around for that. We do ask that at the end of this session you clear out, because we just need to do some prepping of the space. But there is opportunity in between the 2 sessions for you to come outside. All 3 authors will be there with their books. You can purchase books, get them signed, and of course, chat. This is part of the beauty of WAM, is that all our authors are really approachable, and this is a friendly, small festival. So if you have more questions, please come up and approach our authors. But I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and can we please give a big round of applause to Siang Lu, Shirley and Julie Janson. And Ray Nick.